Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Starting Your New Food Traceability Journey. My name is Angela Ferguson. I'm the Director of Marketing at ReposiTrak, and I'll be helping to facilitate today's webinar and offer technical support to our speakers. I'm just going to go through a few small housekeeping details before we begin. Today's event is hosted by two special guests, our very own Derek Hannum, Chief Customer Officer at ReposiTrak, and Dr. Benjamin Miller, Vice President of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at the Acheson Group. Before we get started, I'd like to remind all of our attendees that you will be on mute for the duration of the session to ensure audio quality. However, we will be accepting questions through the presentation and have saved time for Q&A at the end. Two of the most common questions we get are regarding the slides and whether the broadcast is being recorded. I'm happy to say that we are recording the presentation, and it will be emailed out to our attendees and will be available on the ReposiTrak website with full audio and Q&A afterward. Just give us about 24 to 48 hours to upload things, and you'll receive an email with links to the recording and a special resource page that you can see and share. You can also ask questions during the webinar in the box shown on the screen, and we will pose those to our speakers at the end of the webinar. Okay, let's get started with an introduction to today's speakers. Dr. Ben Miller is Vice President of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at the Acheson Group. He is an epidemiologist with experience in foodborne outbreak investigation. He's led human and animal food regulatory programs for the state of Minnesota and has served on the FDA's IFT Task Order 6 pilot projects for improving product tracing along the food supply chain. His PhD thesis was on the use of critical tracking events and key data elements to improve the traceability of food throughout the supply chain to reduce the burden of foodborne illness. Now I'll hand it off to our host, ReposiTrak Chief Customer Officer, Derek Hannum.
Thanks, Angela. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate everybody spending some time with us today as we dive into FSMA 204 traceability. I'm delighted to have Ben Miller on the traceability webinar with us this week. We often do these without a special guest, and so it's terrific to have Ben. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Acheson Group, they really are the preeminent food safety and public health consultancy in the world. And so it is with great pleasure that we have a partnership with the Acheson Group where we're bringing really very affordable assessments for FSMA 204 and our solutions to the marketplace to help the entire supply chain deal with the coming burden of FSMA 204. And so Ben, one of the things that we're doing as we work with our customers and in the supply chain is we get lots of questions. And so we thought it would be a great format to just do more of a Q&A with you today for some of the common questions we get that we think will help the attendees to understand better FSMA 204 and the impact on them, as well as their customers and trading partners. And then, as Angela mentioned, for anybody on the call, please submit your own questions because we will have time at the end to hopefully answer any questions that you offer today on the webinar. So let's get started, Ben, and I'll queue you up for a few questions. So let's start off with just kind of a general overview. Oftentimes people seem to be confused about how FSMA 204 is different than One Forward, One Back and the Bioterrorism Act. So can you just give us the landscape and help us understand generally what are the big differences and why is FSMA 204 so different than anything the supply chain has ever dealt with before?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's good to be with you this morning, afternoon, Derek, and good to be with everybody here as part of this webinar. And I think if you looked at my introductory slide there, I've been working in the public health space all the way back to about 2002, 2001, 2002 is when I started working as an epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health. And so I've luckily or unluckily, depending on which way you look at it, I had the opportunity to kind of have a front row seat to both kind of outbreaks as it's related to produce, a variety of different food items, over the past 20 years, and some of the changes in regulation that we're talking about right here, how they've changed in response to dealing with some of those outbreaks. So I worked as an epidemiologist, then worked at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture doing a lot of traceback investigations, especially kind of in the mid to late 2000 period when FSMA was being considered and passed, and Section 204 comes from FSMA. So really had an opportunity to participate in some of the things that drove some of that change. You mentioned the IFT Task Order 6, and so that was the group that really kind of came up with the idea around what critical tracking events are and key data elements. So it was interesting to see that show up finally in the final rule some 10, 12 years later. And I know ReposiTrak's been working in this space for a long time too. It was one of its original intents was to be able to address some of the issues around traceability and the traceability rule as it came out of FSMA back in 2011. So good to be here with everybody in 2023 talking about traceability. But
right.
so when we look back at the Bioterrorism Act, and that's kind of how it's referred to colloquially within the food industry, that was to really address just sort of record keeping within the supply chain so that we knew where food was coming from and where it was going at a high level. And that's really kind of been the state of play ever since. So that's where we talk a lot about one forward, one back. Who did I get product from? Where did I send product to? In terms of being able to knit together the supply chain. When we understood some of the complexities around traceability, and I experienced this a lot myself when I was trying to conduct traceback investigations, there were certain points in the supply chain where you would just lose fidelity in terms of traceability, especially through distribution, but also through commingling of products, both at packing houses, repacking, and processing. So it was difficult to figure out, okay, if I'm starting an investigation in a retail location or a restaurant and trying to trace a specific product, and not just a specific product, but probably like a lot or a few shipments of a specific product, trying to figure out where that came from or where it originated from in the supply chain was pretty difficult. We were pretty much going off of first in, first out, and bills of lading and purchase orders. And so FSMA 204, again, was part of the Food Safety Modernization Act that was passed back in 2011. And so the intent of that was to improve traceability for, at the time, what we called high risk foods within the supply chain. Now we've got Food Traceability List foods that we talk about when we talk about the Section 204, the Traceability Rule. I'll use those terms interchangeably, but really what this gets us to is essentially kind of case level traceability. So for the foods that have been identified by FDA as being FTL foods or on the Food Traceability List, there's a need for the most part to be able to trace those foods from the point that a traceability lot code is assigned in the supply chain to the time that it's received at a retail establishment or a restaurant, and be able to track that with the fidelity in most instances of kind of case level traceability. And so that's a bit of a game changer in terms of the ability for the FDA to be able to trace product back, but certainly it's much different, as you said, Derek, in terms of what the fidelity or the resolution of traceability has been in general in the food supply chain up until this point.
Great, Ben, thanks. That's very helpful. You mentioned the Food Traceability List a couple of times. There's clearly, a target list now that is impacted by FSMA 204. It's many thousands of items and SKUs in the food supply chain, to be sure. But a lot of people are wondering, how did the list come about? What's the protocol or methodology? And oftentimes people are asking me, would we expect the list to change? Because the FDA has made it clear in their writings and presentations that it's their expectation, and it's certainly consistent with the blueprint, the new era of smarter food safety, that this traceability will be expanding beyond this current list. But help us understand how the current Food Traceability List actually came about.
Sure. So, and there's a link down at the bottom of the slide. So for people that really want to dig into the, many dozens page long report that explains the methodology, it's there for those that want to read it. But essentially, the agency looked at what the factors were that they needed to consider as part of this risk ranking model that was actually part of FSMA itself, and then broke those out into 7 areas. So we can see those here. So how frequently were both pathogen and food pairs essentially associated with some of these items? So like frequency of outbreak and occurrence of illness and severity of illness. Obviously that's going to be pathogen specific in most instances. What's the likelihood of contamination, at different points in the supply chain? And then how likely is it if something's contaminated that it's going to support growth of a pathogen. And you can see, I won't read the rest of them, but those are the things that go into the risk ranking model and then create all of the foods that are on the food traceability list. That list will be revised every 5 years by the agency. If something were to fall off that list at that point of revision, it would fall off immediately. If something's added to that list, there'll be a 2-year kind of time frame for compliance. So something new gets added into the food traceability list, because we identify some new pathogen product combination that really seems to be driving outbreaks. That's the process by which that'll be identified.
Got it. So let's dig in a little bit. I know everybody has a lot of curiosity about, what's on the list, and the FDA has some great resources on the website. I think this is right from the FDA's website, if I'm not mistaken. But there's sort of the general category of products, and then there's all the detail, right? And oftentimes the questions we get asked are about the detail. I do this species, or I create this product, and how about nut butters, and where does all of that fit in? And so maybe you can just walk us through a few of these and help us understand a little bit more detailed level what's really on the list.
Yeah, and I think we've got 3 slides here that kind of walk through that full FDA list. But the thing to kind of look at and consider here when we're thinking about traceability is there's different points in the process at which something becomes or could become a food traceable list food, right? So we've got things like cheeses or soft cheeses that are identified as an FTL food. Not all of the inputs into that, so we take pasteurized milk, let's say, that is not as an ingredient identified as an FTL food. So when we think about traceability, that would not be an ingredient that somebody had to track into their soft cheese production process. But there may be other ingredients if you're adding, let's say, herbs or something like that to a soft cheese that doesn't go through a kill step. Those would be FTL foods. So you have to really think about and really map out your process of what are all my inputs and ingredients, what of those are FTL foods, are there associated kill steps in place, and then we're going to create a traceability lot code associated with the FTL food as part of its production process. And then there are other FTL foods like shell eggs and this slide that are going to start their life, if you will, as an FTL food, and then need to be traced through the supply chain for the most part, depending on use, unless some exemption applies. And we'll talk a little bit about those in subsequent slides. So cheeses, nut butters, the ingredients that go into those don't necessarily constitute an FTL food, but the end product does. Another example to think about too is like maybe a vegetable sandwich, for example. So you've got a sandwich that includes bread and things like that. Well, a cut tomato coming in as an FTL food, well, that sandwich then becomes a food traceable food too as it moves through the supply chain because it contains a tomato and isn't going to go through a kill step. So it's where we start to get into all the complexity of these kind of one to many and many to many relationships right, between ingredients and finished products in the supply chain. And so here we can see, a lot of the things that are listed on this slide are produce or would be considered produce under the produce safety rule. So there's pretty tight agreement between some of the regulatory requirements in the traceability rule and the produce safety rule. So things that are identified as foods that would be regularly eaten raw as part of the produce safety rule show up here for the most part. It's part of the food traceability list food, if you will. And that includes things like fresh cut fruits as well. So, and then we got to get into the fin fish. And the thing to point out here is that when we look at like produce, typically that's going to be fresh produce. When we get into the categories that include things like fin fish, that's going to be fresh and frozen. So frozen vegetables and produce for the most part are excluded from the FTL food list. But if we're dealing with seafood, frozen is still considered part of that. And that again gets back to that risk ranking model in terms of how frequently have we seen pathogen product combinations associated with illness. And then down at the bottom, you can see the ready to eat deli salads as well. So a pretty extensive list, especially when you look at it in this format. It's FDA has done a good job, I think, about providing examples that go with each one of these categories. But that's a lot of things that move through the food supply chain have been identified here.
Yeah, definitely. Again, certainly many thousands of items or SKUs that we would typically find in retail food establishments, grocery stores, restaurants, convenience stores even. And so it looks like the list based on the 5-year lock-in and 2 years to add a delay once they add a new item. This is going to be our list for a while. This is what the supply chain needs to be prepared for, and really this is where the work is going to be done in the supply chain. There aren't obviously any grocery stores, restaurants, probably most convenience stores carry these items, and obviously all of the suppliers and distributors in the supply chain that either produce or hold these items all impacted, right? So the question we get a lot is, who is impacted? Are there exemptions? Does it apply to me? We get it a lot from retailers. We do lots of work with wholesalers and retailers at ReposiTrak, and so I have lots of grocery store operators who would like to think they could be exempt, or maybe it wouldn't apply to them. Maybe you can help us understand, are there exemptions? Who does it apply to?
Yeah, and so we could do probably a 2-hour webinar just on the exemptions, because they're fairly complicated depending on which segments you're talking about, and these are some of the broad categories that FDA has identified for exemptions under the rule. And that said, I think we look at retail food establishments, certainly at an individual store level, there's a dollar amount threshold that's adjusted for inflation that it's cut off, but it's fairly low. When we look at some of these other categories, commingling of raw agricultural products, that applies to some things that are on the FTL, but not to any produce that would be covered under the produce safety rules. So all the things that we just looked at, that kind of produce isn't going to be exempt. Farms, that cutoff's pretty low. It's about $25,000, again, adjusted for inflation. It's a little bit higher than that now. But so while there are a lot of exemptions, I would also go back to kind of what we were talking about before and say there's a lot of complexity within the supply chain. So if I'm somebody that's selling broadly within the supply chain, if I'm going to qualify for one of these exemptions to, let's say I'm selling to you, Derek, you might apply a kill step to some of the product, the FTL product that I'm selling to you. But if I sell to somebody else, they may not. And so depending on how many customers you have downstream, there would be different requirements for, for Derek, I have to maybe have a written agreement in place that would say, yeah, we both agree, and we're going to update this every 3 years, that you're always consistently applying a kill step for the product that I'm supplying to you. But that other customer, I'm going to have all these critical tracking events and key data elements in place. So, I think as people are thinking about how their product moves through the supply chain, it's just an important consideration. So how much complexity is there? And if there's even a moderate amount of complexity, really designing a system that can accommodate some of these key critical tracking events and key data elements, it's going to be important, because the likelihood that you'll be able to really exempt yourself from the traceability rule across the board is fairly low.
Yeah, that's been our perspective from the beginning, Ben, as we've worked with up and down the supply chain, is if you're granting an exemption to a supplier or a customer, there's still, in many cases, a record-keeping requirement. So it's not like that record-keeping requirement goes away. It might be less stringent than collecting all the key data elements, but there's still a record-keeping requirement, and you may be actually taking on the risk of confirming that exemption is still in place from year to year, which most companies aren't. With many customers and many suppliers, they just don't have the means to do that. So our advice is keep the exemptions to an absolute minimum and try to bring as many of your trading partners into FSMA 204 compliance as possible. So we've mentioned KDEs, we've mentioned CTEs, I think. So this is the framework. Looking at your bio, you were into CTEs and KDEs before the rest of us even knew it was a thing. So I'm sure you can explain it in good detail to us to help us understand this framework that actually drives the FSMA 204 traceability record keeping requirement.
Sure. You know, a lot of this was actually based off of kind of HACCP principles at the time too. You know, we said, well, if you're going to, most people in the quality space of, you know, food safety understand HACCP principles. And so you've got, you know, critical control points, which are sort of similar, you know, to CTEs in a process or in your supply chain. And then in a critical control point model, there's things that, you know, you need to do to make sure that you're achieving a 5-log reduction of pathogens, et cetera, depending on what the hazard is that you're trying to control for. And so that's kind of the analogy to the KDE then. So it's looking at your process and identifying where in your process there's a tracking event where you need to record these key data elements. And for each type of CTE, there's different key data elements that need to be recorded and then passed forward in the supply chain. And so this is an example of a slide that comes from, you know, FDA's materials. And this is actually, I think, you know, really good material to go look at and figure out, okay, what are the KDEs that I might need to apply depending on what point in the supply chain or where I sit in the supply chain. I would say there's probably, you know, when you start to peel back the layers of the onion, pardon the pun, but, you know, it's, you know, there's some complexity there in terms of, okay, well, are there many inputs into this? You know, what actually constitutes a transformation event? Is repacking a transformation event? What do I need to think about if I'm, you know, repacking versus commingling? When would I apply food traceable lot code? So it's spelled out, I think, in good detail on the FDA site. Once you start to try to operationalize, it's a little bit where the complexity starts to come into play. So, and that's just based on kind of past experience, both in thinking about this as part of IFT work that we did, and then also just, you know, conducting tracebacks and trying to come up with good case studies that kind of prove this point. But yeah.
Good. So that's helpful. You know, the one thing that we mentioned when we talk about the critical tracking events is there certainly are critical tracking events at closer to the point of harvest that are somewhat unique to the parties who do that work, who, you know, whether it's fishing or, you know, any raw agricultural commodity. So those are pretty specialized, but everybody in the supply chain, if you're a participant in the supply chain, you either ship a product at some point, you receive a product at some point, or many companies do both, right? So the shipping and receiving critical tracking events really are going to impact essentially everybody in the supply chain to varying degrees. And for some companies like distributors, it is the game. It is the whole game is the shipping and receiving critical tracking events and key data element collection and sharing. So that's good. Thanks for expounding on that a little bit. Well, I guess it kind of sets up this next question. Isn't it enough that I can just maintain the records? So we've actually had this question more than a couple of times. Can I just keep the records, and then in the case of a recall, or if my customer needs them, I can certainly provide them on demand? Isn't it enough to just do record keeping and keep those records internally?
Yeah, and, you know, I think it goes back to a little bit of what we were talking about at the beginning. You know, it's when we look at the complexity of what needs to be captured in terms of those KDEs and, you know, identifying those critical tracking events, especially the ones that you just talked about, Derek, the shipping and the receiving ones. You know, this isn't really the bioterrorism rule anymore, right? It's not one up, one back. There's quite a bit more data that's moving through the supply chain that's associated with shipping and receiving. And so, you know, let's say you're in an investigation where FDA comes, reaches out to you, or, you know, one of the states reaches out and said, hey, you know, we're conducting a traceback investigation, and we think, you know, product X is potentially associated with 50 cases of salmonella. We need your records. And so if you don't have those systems in place that are cleanly passing and maintaining that KDE level data, you know, at the CTE level between shipping and receiving or transformation or whichever, you know, you can become reliant on people upstream to provide you with information that you would need to be regulatorily compliant, you know, in an investigation situation. And if you can't provide those records in a timely manner, I mean, that's really kind of the cornerstone to why the agency has this rule there in the first place. It's to get back to and identify the source of an outbreak as quickly as possible. So it becomes, you know, a compliance and potential legal issue if you can't meet the agency's request.
And that requirement, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you have to produce those records on demand within 24 hours in a sortable spreadsheet, I think is the language in FSMA 204. Is that correct?
yeah, for, almost all entities, unless you're, kind of fall into one of those small categories. But yeah, for the vast majority of people in the supply chain, it's going to be in their spreadsheet format, and that's actually spelled out in the regulation itself.
Yep, great. Okay, kill step. We talked about kill step a couple of times. We get this question quite a bit. Obviously, products that start off on the food traceability list were all commodities. Many of them end up going through some sort of processing or manufacturing that involves a kill step. So can you help shed some light on when the record keeping stops? Again, the kill step, who's responsible for knowing there's a kill step? If you could just talk about that a little bit, I think it would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, and so that's something that I think it's a common question when we think about, okay, well, I'm producing an ingredient that is going to be used in a food that's going to go through a kill step. So once that kill step is applied, you don't need to maintain any records kind of going forward in the supply chain, if you will. And so that tends to mesh up pretty well with the regulations around preventive controls, right? So I've identified my hazards, I've identified my appropriate preventive control. You have to maintain records that kill step was applied appropriately, but you should have that in place if you've got an effective food safety plan in place. And if there's no written agreement between the, kind of the supplier of the ingredient and the party that's going to apply the kill step, you do have to maintain those records as you would if it's an FTL food up until the point that kill step is applied. We were talking a little bit before about, written exemptions within the supply chain. This is one space that, if all of the trading partners within the supply chain can maintain written agreements throughout that the kill step's going to be applied, and that the written agreement's reviewed at the appropriate time frame, that can be an exemption. But the more points in the supply chain that you are sort of between the person producing the FTL food and where that kill step happens, the more complexity there is in terms of maintaining some of those agreements. I would go back to and touch a little bit on what we were talking about before, and thinking about just exemptions overall. If you think that you're going to be mostly exempt, just think about that though, in terms of market access. So if you're creating an FTL food, am I going to have a traceability system in place by 2026 when the requirement comes into place, if I want to expand into markets where a kill step may not apply? And so I think it's good for people to think about market access too, in the context of just having some of these systems up and ready and running, and ready to go.
Yeah, it's a great point. We often talk about how traceability, if it can be done inexpensively with manageable complexity or very little complexity, it's a good thing for the supply chain. It's a really good thing for everybody, right? It's a goal that every company really should strive to have better supply chain visibility and transparency if they can make it work, right? And that's really the key.
Right, and that does go back to I think recognizing that FTL list will be updated, every 5 years, and so there's always a possibility that something gets added, right? And so then you've got to kind of rethink, okay, well now I'm selling an FTL food that wasn't an FTL food before. How do I get there, and how do I make sure that I'm compliant as quickly as possible?
Yeah, good point. Okay, so this one's kind of interesting, but creating a lot code. So there's obviously clear requirements in FSMA 204 around creating a lot code and the critical tracking events related to creating a lot code. But once a lot code's created, if I'm actually receiving product that has a TLC, a traceability lot code, can I assign it a new lot code, or under what conditions could I create a new lot code for a product that already has a traceability lot code assigned?
Yeah, and so I think it's important to think about the traceability lot codes, kind of the backbone of which the whole supply chain traceability and Section 204 really relies on. It's making sure that there's integrity in terms of what point in the process that traceability lot code is applied, and then how it's shared forward in the supply chain. So the regulation's pretty clear in terms of there's very limited instances when somebody can create a new traceability lot code. So you've got, when somebody initially packs a raw agricultural commodity, other than a food obtained from a fishing vessel. So, and then for seafood, it's when there's the first land-based receiving of food from a fishing vessel. So that's when a traceability lot code gets created. Or it's when there's a transformation event for food. So that can be when a traceability lot code food or food traceable list food is used as an ingredient that doesn't receive a kill step to create another product, or it can be an instance where a product is, let's say, repacked. So you've got two different lot codes of the same FTL food to make a new lot. That would be an example of a transformation event. But if you had two of the same lot, sort of like into like, that wouldn't necessarily be a transformation event for a traceability lot codes standpoint. So you can see again, like even within some of these CTEs, depending on what you're doing and what the source of the product is, there's some complexity that people need to think about in terms of when and how you want to create these traceability lot codes.
Got it. Good. Thanks for clarifying that, because that one has come up a few times. And then let's just talk about who it applies to from a geography standpoint. Does it apply to every supplier with food traceability list products, even if they're produced outside the U.S.?
It does, yeah. If somebody wants to import food and FTL food into the U.S., then they have to be able to comply with the Food Traceability Rule. So it's important to know that from a compliance standpoint, the way the rule is written is it applies to those who physically hold the product, but that doesn't prohibit somebody like an importer or a broker from actually doing and maintaining the record. So that's something that can be delegated to entities like that who don't physically hold the product as part of the importation process, but the covered entity under the rules, so the person who's legally responsible needs to make sure that whoever they designate that to from a record keeping requirement is doing what they should be. But the short answer is yes. If you want to bring product into the US that's an FTL food, you have to comply.
Yeah, that's a really important point because that you made about the broker or the importer who may not actually physically hold the food, but is responsible for the importation of the product, and it might go through a third-party warehouse or some other facility that they don't actually control or even own. They can keep the records, but the legal obligation is for the party that actually holds the product, right?
Right, that's correct.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Okay, again, distributors, right? A lot of people we spend a lot of time, we do a lot of work with wholesalers and distributors, and obviously this is, a lot of times people are surprised that this includes all food service and restaurants, right? So when you think about we think the number is, some estimates are somewhere around 1.5 million to 2 million facilities if you think about all the restaurants, all the grocery stores, all the points of distribution in the supply chain all the way back to the farms that need a FSMA 204 solution in place. Quite a daunting undertaking to be done by January 2026. I mean, let's be honest that not everybody in the supply chain is going to make it by the enforcement deadline of 2026. There's just, the scope of the work is simply too massive. But we get lots of questions from distributors and wholesalers about this idea of case level. Do I actually need to do lot code tracking at the case level? Because it
Derek, we lost your audio.
Hello, is my audio back?
Yeah, you're back. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. I lost my audio. Hopefully this is okay. So back to the question was really just distributors. What's it look like? This is case level tracking, right? And what's that look like as products are moving through distribution centers?
Yeah, this is a big one, and I'll preface it with a little background in terms of when I did these kind of investigations as an epidemiologist, we would start with information first. Who was sick, and essentially other epidemiologists would interview them and figure out, okay, well, what were some common places they might have eaten at or purchased food from prior, especially in the 5 days prior to when they got sick. And so when we're identifying potential sources of exposure for human illness cases of, let's say, salmonella or E. coli, you really obviously start at the restaurant or retail level, because that's where the vast majority of people get their food. And so a traceback investigation, that's where it starts. It starts at restaurants, grocery stores for the most part. And then, the next step back in the supply chain, to your point, Derek, is typically, wholesaler or distributor, right? And shipping cases of food for the most part to these stores or restaurants, where they're opened up and sold to consumers. I mean, and this was always, to me, the biggest kind of mountain to climb in terms of traceability, kind of this idea of case level traceability, just knowing the way that the food distribution and wholesale systems are set up. By and large, they're not set up to track that level of detail, especially into individual customers. So you're loading up your truck, and how do I do this if I'm not going to have to scan every case? But it was at that point, essentially, in the investigation, so doing a traceback investigation, where we would a lot of times sort of lose the trail, if you will, because lot code information wasn't available. You have to look in first, but there's hundreds of cases that's moving. And so first out pieces of product, you're trying to time bound, like, okay, within a week or within a 2-week period, what was outgoing product. And so you really lost the resolution in the supply chain that would let you get back potentially to the source of the outbreak. So I understand why the agency kind of, wrote the rule the way that it did to accomplish its goals in that case, is, to make sure that they're getting better, higher fidelity lot code information and being able to trace that back. So what all of that essentially means is that, yeah, you need to be able to, in order to demonstrate compliance with this rule, track that traceability lot code into the point that it's received by your customer, if that's a grocery store, if that's a restaurant. And so, I think one of the things, and I know you'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of how ReposiTrak works, but it's, minimizing the amount of effort that one needs to do that, just because, again, when I thought about this as a regulator in my past, it's like, well, this is going to require a significant change in the way, operations actually happen on the floor of a warehouse. And so, I think companies that can come up with creative solutions that are able to achieve compliance and not have to rely on people to scan every case that's moving through their warehouse, I think that's what makes a compliant solution to the traceability rule, closer to reality.
Yeah, it's a good point. We think of these, large distribution centers, wholesaler operations, distribution operations as major connectors in the food supply chain, because in most cases they have thousands of suppliers, and they might actually have thousands of customers. They certainly have thousands of customer locations in some cases. So it can be a big choke point when you think about FSMA 204 record keeping. It's arguably the most challenging part of the supply chain, or could be, when you think about just the volume of record keeping that has to take place, and the notion of actually trying to do that with labels, scanning labels, and at the case level as you're unloading trucks in a high throughput food distribution warehouse is just not very practical or feasible. So that's a lot of our conversation and our work with the ReposiTrak Traceability Network is focused on making it easy to get that product through the distribution centers and onto stores and restaurants with minimal disruption or operational complexity. So, okay, sorry about the audio. I'm not sure what happened there, but it sounds like we're back on track. So again, as a retailer or a restaurant, and again, we're getting this, we work with lots of retailers, so we get this question a lot, is what do I have to do at receiving, and why do I need to do this? And is there a record keeping requirement for me too, or can I just rely on my supplier to take care of things?
Yeah, so, again, for the vast majority of retailers or restaurants that aren't going to be, exempt based on dollar amount, these receiving KDEs is spelled out on the slide, or what needs to, you need to have a system to take this in, right? And again, if I just go back and talk about when we start a foodborne illness investigation or a traceback investigation, this is the type of information that, your state or local public health department is going to be looking for in terms of, what was the traceability lot code of the food that would have been available at the time when somebody who got sick was making their purchase or dined in a restaurant. how much of that was on hand, what's the actual product description, where did it come from. So all the things that we see here are what allow investigators to start to, the beginning of their traceback process, start to stitch together the supply chain. So that is why that level of detail is part of the rule as written, and the expectation is that those receiving those products are maintaining this.
Okay, good. Yeah, you used the phrase stitch together. We've used that a lot internally and in our conversations with customers to help them understand what the goal is really from the FDA's perspective, is to create what we also use the term e-pedigree, right? To create some sort of, you talked a lot about the fidelity of the data, to increase the fidelity of the data by having, better data sharing as the products move through the supply chain is really the key to the whole thing. So. Okay, this is really interesting to look at. I want you to explain what these maps represent. So, what if I don't have a system today? Depending on where I am in the supply chain, maybe I'm not very technically sophisticated, or maybe I am, but we've just never had to deal with this before. It's all new to us. Help us understand what these maps represent, because I think they're quite intriguing.
Yes, this is actually a map that came out about 4 years ago for some research that was done. I think by some researchers that are associated with, I want to say, the Department of Energy, but they were looking at, essentially, how does the food supply chain work in the U.S. And one of the things that they produced as part of their research was kind of visual maps, just showing the common distribution flows or patterns kind of between counties within the U.S. And so, you can see there's, especially kind of on that top map, there's some strong places where food starts, especially when we look at California and fresh produce, and, what are the paths that those products take, from a distribution standpoint throughout the country. But, I think the importance of this visual here is to just talk about, there's a lot of complexity within the food supply chain and the food distribution system within the US. And, in order to get to a point of compliance overall, by 2026 for the food industry, there's going to have to be a lot of, essentially coordination and people thinking about what are the CTEs and KDEs that I need to be collecting and sharing, right now in 2023, because it's going to take some time to get all of those systems stitched together in a way that, is going to make this functional. So this is, we know the food supply chain is complex. This is just kind of a visual way of looking at that complexity.
Yeah, it reinforces the why keep moving now, right? And we have this conversation a lot when people say, oh, the enforcement's, nearly 3 years away, and why should I get moving now? You should get moving now because of this, right? Because it's enormously complex. It affects 1.5 million facilities and stores and restaurants, and not everybody's going to make it. So if you want to be in compliance by January 2026, the time to start was yesterday. For many companies. And so we're having lots of those conversations around the timing and when things should be happening. So we touched on this very briefly in the beginning, but this is great. I think what the Acheson Group is doing, offering this super cost-effective assessment for companies who need more information and expertise around FSMA 204 and how it applies to them. Ben, just tell us a little bit about this, because I think this is really terrific.
Yeah, I think just based on the conversations that we've been having, we know there's just a lot of questions out there in terms of, how does the rule apply to me, and does it apply to me? And if it does, how do I get about starting to figure out what CTEs do I have, what KDEs do I need to be collecting? And so, what we wanted to do is just create an opportunity for you to connect with us, and we're happy to sit down and, have a Zoom call, work through, some of what, look at your supply chain, essentially. What are you making? How are you handling it? What are some of the shipping and receiving issues that you may have? Do you have a transformation event? So just assisting people that might feel like they need a little extra help in defining what that process is, what the CTEs are, and what the applicable KDEs would be. So that's really the goal of this, is to take what is in the rule and help you apply it to your operations. And then coming out of that, we can give you an initial written assessment of, here are the applicable CTEs, the KDEs, and then provide you with some next steps in terms of how you get to ultimately writing a food traceability plan. So that's something we didn't talk a lot about in depth and detail, but that's also something that you need to be compliant with the regulation at the end of the day. Is much like you have a food safety plan, you have to have a food traceability plan as well. So.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, to be able to get consultancy from an organization like the Acheson Group for $500 fits certainly well inside anybody's budget, regardless of the size of the company. So we think that's tremendous. And so if anybody's interested, there's the email address that you would simply send an email to the group, the Acheson Group, and they'll follow up with you. So we're coming up on a little bit of a summary here, and then we'll get to your questions. So just thanks, Ben. Tremendous information, really fantastic to help bring your insights, your expertise in particular to this issue that so many people have questions around. Look, it's clear FSMA 204 brings substantial new challenges to the supply chain, regardless of where you are in the supply chain. It's not one forward, one back. It's not the Bioterrorism Act. The key is sharing data. When products moving through the supply chain, you have to share the traceability data with your trading partners. Very few companies only have a handful of customers or suppliers, right? It is the grocery supply chain is many to many in most cases. And so being able to share the data, to receive it from your suppliers and share it with your customers in a way that is operationally feasible and cost effective, very low cost, right? That's the challenge here. And that's why the ReposiTrak Traceability Network is in the process of rolling out right now and signing up our retailers and wholesalers and suppliers as we speak. So just real quick plug, no hardware, no software. This is proven technology that ReposiTrak has used for more than 20 years to track product shipments into stores. It's not based on a labeling system. It can work with labels, but it doesn't require standards. And we guarantee it to be the lowest cost solution and the easiest to use. So if you are interested in learning more about the ReposiTrak Traceability Network, my information will be on the final slide. So with that, I think we'll go out to Angela, who's wrangling the questions from the attendees. Go ahead, Angela.
Yes. All right, thank you. We did get quite a few questions, so I'm just going to start at the top. Okay, first question. If you are harvesting vegetables and placing it in an RPC case or plastic boxes during harvesting, is that considered to be initial packing? The product is then cooled.
Based on what you've described, no, that wouldn't be initial packing because it's going to go through cooling. I'm assuming at that point that it's going to get further packed after that cooling process, and so it's at that end, that process after cooling would be considered initial packing. Based on what you've been able to describe, but that's a good example of just where, being able to kind of look at the specific actions that are happening, within your operation helps get the most accurate answer to that question. But based on what you've described, no, that wouldn't be initial pack.
Thank you. Okay, are pre-packaged salad kits considered ready-to-eat deli salads?
No, I think a prepackaged salad kit wouldn't be considered a ready-to-eat deli salad, probably by a common definition. I'm thinking about something that's a clamshell or it's got a cellophane top on it or something like that. But that would still be considered a food, an FTL food, because it's a cut leafy green in most instances. So that's a product that would still fall under the food traceability rule. Kind of those prepackaged salads, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Also, too, because they don't go through a kill step at this point. So.
Right, makes sense. Ben, can you please confirm the detail on the kill step? This question comes from someone who said that they're an acidified food producer, heating product to a minimum of 185 degrees with CCPs of pH, time, and temp. We get some fresh ingredients from distributors. Must the distributor supply traceability documents?
So up until the point that you receive the product, so if you've got foods that are on the FTL list, if you're receiving those, the expectation is that you would, or that people in the supply chain up to you, and you would have a receiving CTE. up until the point that you apply that kill step. And then any subsequent distribution of that product, you wouldn't have to maintain records. That would be an example of where some of these exemptions could apply. So if you have a consistent supplier of, let's say, let's say you're canning some kind of produce product that would normally be covered, if you have a written agreement that makes it through every step of the supply chain where those CTEs and KDEs would otherwise have to be maintained, that's an example of where there may be an exemption. So again, it depends on, for me anyways, as I'm thinking about this, it depends on the complexity of your supply chain and how many different suppliers you have, and what's the most efficient way to manage that.
So it says, you mentioned how operationalizing compliance with FSMA 204 could be difficult. Is there a standard way to start?
There is. I mean, I think the first step is looking at your process overall. So much like we think about when we create a food safety plan, for example, the way that I like to think about this is starting with a diagram of your supply chain and your processes too, because obviously there's, especially if you have transformation events, there's points in your process where you need to think about your inputs and you need to think about your outputs. So it's starting to think in a similar way that you would as you're creating your food safety plan, and then identifying those CTEs and KDEs, and then from there, putting all that together so that you have both a written traceability plan, but also that written traceability plan needs to describe how you're going to maintain these CTEs and KDEs. And so that's where a description of, the systems that you're using comes into play as well. So that's an expectation. If you look at the requirements of what's needed for a food traceability plan, you have to be able to say, how am I going to record this information as well? So there's a few puzzle pieces that need to fit together, but really that first step is figuring out at a high level, what are the CTEs and KDEs that would apply based on my operations.
I'd like, Angela, if I may, I'd just like to tag onto that very quickly, because we're working with a lot of companies that are in that very stage right now, trying to figure out what are the first steps and how do I get moving on this, because they want to get moving and they're not really sure what the first steps are. Here's something that we've learned from working on this for 2 years now. This is it's all food safety. Most of the people on this call probably have food safety in their title. Certainly a lot of them do, right? It's a food safety objective, but in many cases, it's a supply chain data management exercise, right? So if you're a food safety professional, my advice to you is pull your supply chain folks into this as quickly as you can, and your IT folks, because at some point you're going to have systems considerations and you're going to have supply chain considerations related to your suppliers and customers that aren't typically within the domain of a food safety quality assurance expert. So get your other stakeholders involved now, help them understand what FSMA really means, FSMA 204 really means for your operation, because it's not just it's really not a food safety exercise for the most part. It's a food safety objective, but it's a supply chain data management exercise.
Next question. As a wholesale distributor, does utilizing the ReposiTrak traceability network mean that my customers will get an email with each delivery I make to them? Will they get a separate email for each item, or one digest email with KDEs for all items we delivered on a given day?
So that one might be for me. Yeah, it doesn't happen in email. So the way the ReposiTrak Traceability Network works, we actually collect the data automatically from product movements from systems. And we've done this for many years for financial purposes, not traceability purposes, but we'll build a traceability record in ReposiTrak for you. Keep in mind, the requirement here for most operators is that you have an archive of your information that's retrievable. You don't necessarily need it to run your operation in most cases, right? So you just have to keep your traceability records somewhere where you can get to them in the event of a recall or a traceback. And that's what the ReposiTrak Traceability Network does. If you want to learn more about how ReposiTrak solves the problem, happy to talk to you. My information is on the screen. Send me an email and we'll explain how it works.
Okay, this one is a specific one about all types of products produced with nuts. I know that we mentioned nut butters on the food traceability list, but it says we are a supplier of nut meats. So tree nuts, pecans, almonds, walnuts, peanuts, hazelnuts, cashews, Brazil nuts, macadamia nuts, and dried fruits. Are these items exempt?
If an item isn't specifically listed by itself on the food traceability list, then it wouldn't be subject to the rule, if you will. So we need to think about, right, peanuts by themselves are not on the FTL list, right? But that's used as an input to make a nut butter. It's the nut butter that becomes the FTL food, and that's when the requirements kick in at that point in the supply chain. So good question. That's why it's good to check that list to see, see if the food that you produce is actually on that list or not. And then you would not, if your food's not on that list, you're not subject to those record keeping requirements. But your customer might be if they're creating an FTL food using your ingredients.
Okay. This question is about shell eggs. What are acceptable sharing data for a shell egg processing plant? We use Julian date of production and plant number, which let us trace all our products.
Yeah, so that's where we would want to look, at the specific KDE requirements associated with shipping and receiving, depending on where you're sitting in the supply chain. So some of those things like Julian date would apply, for let's say the date of harvest, but you're also going to need to have information like what was the date of shipment, what's the date of receipt. Plant number might be sufficient in terms of location identification. If that can be looked up somewhere else or linked to data that can be provided to FDA at the time, there might be an investigation. So that again is where some of the nuance comes into play in terms of what's the data that you have now. Are there key data elements that you need to think about or create in addition to what you have today, just to make sure that you're getting all the elements there that you need to have in place for compliance.
And I actually get questions from people about, is there a standard for a lot code, right? So is there a lot code standard?
Short answer is no, there is not. So it can be, there's a lot of different ways to put together a lot code, and that can be Julian date location, that can be just a random series of digits that's machine generated depending on, and so there's seen it done a ton of different ways. Obviously there's a produce traceability initiative that talks about a specific format for lot coding. So there's a lot of ways to think about it. That's one thing the agency did not do in terms of the rule itself, was specify data structure. So they said these are the type of data, so it's sort of semi-structured data in the sense that these are the fields that you need to capture, but they're agnostic in terms of the format of those fields, other than things like phone numbers, which should obviously be standardized.
Okay, thanks. We got time for a couple more, Angela.
I have one more.
Okay.
If a product goes through a transformation process, can a new lot code be created?
Yes, and in fact, most times you would have to create a new lot code in those instances. So let's say you're taking, even a single ingredient that might be from different lot codes. So let's say you're taking, even making, let's say, a shredded iceberg salad, but you have 3 different iceberg lots that are going into that shredding process and creating a single lot coming out of it. That would be a transformation event that would need a new traceability lot code. Now, if all of the inputs into that transformation event were the same, then you wouldn't necessarily need to create a new traceability lot code ID. So again, that's where some of, especially in terms of transformation events, being able to get some detail and map that out. So what are my inputs? What's the variability within those inputs? Is it always going to be one supplier or one lot code, or could it be many? That's what's going to dictate, when you need to create a new traceability lot code.
Thank you. One more question did come in, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And it's related. Do consumer prepackaged foods need to be identified with a lot code?
They do not. That's actually something that's not required, under the traceability rule. But what needs to be maintained is that receiving event at the retail or restaurant level. So it isn't the retail consumer packaged good itself that needs a lot code, because in reality, in a lot of these traceback investigations, the product's been consumed and we no longer have it. So, there's not an expectation that that needs to be there. The one exception to that is if there's field packed products, and so there's new requirements for what information would need to be contained on like field packed produce, so that packaging does contain more detail than it was previously required before the rule itself was finalized. But that's a bit of an exception. But for the vast majority of consumer packaged goods, it does not.
Okay, thank you. Well, that concludes our question list. So Derek and Ben, is there any final remarks that you'd like to add?
And any final remarks before we sign off?
No, I just appreciate everybody's time today, and if it's at all helpful, I think you've got two good resources to reach out to here if you've got more questions. So my contact information is up here. Please feel free, email, give me a call, and happy to help.
Thanks, Ben. And on behalf of ReposiTrak, thank you for taking the time to do the webinar today. I think it was extraordinarily helpful. I hope the audience found it very informative and helpful as well. And I'll second the motion to offer for assistance. Please consider both of our companies and us resources for you as you head on your FSMA 204 journey. Thanks, everyone, for all of your time today on the webinar. Take care and good luck. Bye-bye.